July 22nd, 1991. A humid night in Milwaukee, the kind where the air sticks to your skin and the city hums like it's holding its breath. On North 25th Street, a man in handcuffs stumbles into the headlights of a police cruiser, his voice shaking as he points back toward a beige apartment building. Upstairs, in Unit 213, the smell seeps out first, sweet, chemical, rancid, something no one wants to name. Inside, a refrigerator humming, a blue vat bubbling quietly, a drawer filled with Polaroids of bodies posed like broken mannequins. And standing in the middle of it all, calm as if this were any other Tuesday night, is Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. The city would never smell the same again. The name would never fade. And the question, how could this go on for so long, right under everyone's nose, would haunt not just Milwaukee, but an entire country. The tape recorder clicks, and a monotone voice fills the stale Milwaukee air. The words are flat, eerily unremarkable, as though describing a trip to the grocery store. But what Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer cataloged was not errands, not routines, but cravings so abnormal they feel stitched together from nightmares. He confessed that the hunger wasn't about food. Not exactly. It was about permanence. "I wanted them to stay," he once said, in a voice void of guilt. "So I kept them." Imagine walking into that cramped apartment on North 25th Street. A faint chemical tang cuts the air, the refrigerator hums like an accomplice, and behind the door, ordinary, beige, nothing special, are trophies of lives stolen. Not jewelry, not locks of hair, not the innocent tokens killers often cling to, but something primal, anatomical. He had crossed a threshold where flesh was no longer flesh. It was memory, devotion, a grotesque kind of company. The first responding officer gagged when the smell hit him, but Dahmer's neighbors had smelled it long before. Complained of rancid meat, of spoiled air seeping through vents. And yet no one believed the truth. That in the middle of a bustling city block, a man was constructing his own private mausoleum, piece by piece, night after night. That's the dissonance that freezes your blood. There was no shadowy lair deep in some forest, no dungeon hidden beneath a farmhouse. It was all unfolding inside an unremarkable apartment, right under buzzing fluorescent lights and peeling wallpaper. What unnerves me most isn't the brutality, it's the banality. Dahmer didn't look like a monster from a film. He was pale, awkward, forgettable. He could have been the guy behind you at the grocery checkout, fumbling for coins, too shy to make eye contact. And yet, his fridge contained the most horrifying secret of the decade. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not merely about killing. It's about the erosion of boundaries, how desire morphs into fixation, fixation into compulsion, compulsion into atrocity. To study him is to stand at the edge of a black hole and feel its pull, knowing that if you stare long enough, you might start to understand, and that understanding might destroy something in you. This isn't mythology. This isn't folklore. These are police photos, taped confessions, boxes cataloged in evidence rooms. And once you step inside his world, you cannot walk out unchanged. Milwaukee, late 1980s. The city wasn't some crumbling ruin of despair, at least not entirely. It was a mix. Working class grit, taverns with neon beer signs, the steady hum of factories that hadn't yet closed their doors. It smelled of bratwurst and cigarette smoke. The skyline was modest, the streets gray with Midwestern pragmatism. People minded their own business. If you didn't draw attention, you could disappear in plain sight. But the city carried fractures, racial tension, economic disparity, a police force often accused of turning its gaze away from the margins. It was a place where vulnerability could slip through the cracks. A young man of color could vanish, and the headlines wouldn't scream. A hitchhiker could disappear, and the world kept moving. Milwaukee had an ability to forget, to look away, to dismiss. And that is exactly where Dahmer thrived. The late-night bars along Wisconsin Avenue pumped out drunks into streets that were more shadow than light. In those shadows, Dahmer lingered, quiet, solitary, watching, always watching. The city around him provided camouflage. Everyone assumed everyone else was just trying to get by. Nobody wanted to imagine the wolf among them wasn't snarling or foaming. It was sipping a rum and coke, shyly asking if you want to come back for another drink. And the era itself, the broader stage, mattered. This was the tail end of the 20th century, before smartphones, before constant surveillance. You could vanish into the night without leaving a digital fingerprint. Men met in bars and bathhouses without apps recording the evidence. If you trusted the wrong stranger, your face might never appear on the evening news. Milwaukee's housing blocks were lined with cheap apartments, old refrigerators groaning like ghosts, peeling paint curling on walls. Dahmer's unit at the Oxford Apartments was just one among dozens. Neighbors complained of smells, of noises, but they were used to it. Poverty had a stench all its own. Who was going to call the police over one more sour odor? The stage was a perfect contradiction. A city that prided itself on beer, baseball, and Midwestern charm, but underneath, indifference festered. A place where people believed evil wore horns, not wire-rimmed glasses. Where the real horror wasn't lurking in the alleyway. It was in the apartment next door, waiting behind a deadbolt. Milwaukee gave Dahmer both invisibility and opportunity. He didn't need a remote cabin in the woods or a castle on a hill. The anonymity of the city was enough. Every missing poster that curled on a bulletin board, every name announced in hushed tones by a grieving family, all dissolved into the city's background noise. And in that noise, Jeffrey Dahmer built his kingdom. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. The name feels almost clinical now, stripped of its flesh, just another entry in the encyclopedia of infamy. But before the mugshot, before the courtroom, before the word monster fused to his skin, he was just a kid from Bath Township, Ohio. Blonde hair, shy smile, a face that wouldn't stand out in a yearbook lineup. That's what unnerves me. Evil rarely announces itself. It whispers from the quiet ones in the back row. His childhood photographs look almost angelic, the kind of Polaroids parents tuck into wallets. But there were fractures behind those snapshots. A marriage cracking apart at the seams, screaming matches muffled behind suburban walls. A boy retreating into silence while his parents fought like enemies sharing a roof. He found solace not in friends, but in dead animals. Roadkill became his hobby. Dissection his form of meditation. Imagine a teenager crouched in the woods, carefully peeling back skin not with cruelty, but with curiosity. That's the seed. That's where fascination becomes rehearsal. Neighbors described him as polite, if a little strange. Teachers marked him as intelligent but disengaged, a boy who doodled in margins instead of raising his hand. He wasn't the bully. He wasn't the class clown. He was the invisible one, an absence more than a presence. And invisibility, for someone like him, was a gift. As he grew older, the fissures widened. Loneliness calcified into isolation. By adolescence, Dahmer was already drinking. Cheap beer hidden in army jackets, a liquid anesthetic dulling the edges of urges he couldn't explain. Those urges weren't about romance. They weren't about sex in any conventional sense. They were about control, permanence, the terror of abandonment twisted into the fantasy of possession. If people couldn't leave, he couldn't be alone. It's tempting to imagine Dahmer as born evil, a villain prepackaged. But it wasn't that neat. He had moments of almost normalcy. Fishing trips, neighborhood pranks, awkward prom photos. He tried to wear the costume of normal life, but it never fit. Underneath, the hunger grew, gnawing relentless. When you look at Jeffrey Dahmer before the crimes, you don't see a demon. You see an ordinary man, one who laughs nervously, who avoids eye contact, who wants connection but doesn't know how to hold without crushing it. That's the tragedy and the terror, because if he could blend so seamlessly into suburbia, how many others walk among us with appetites we'll never understand until it's far too late? It always begins with something small, something that doesn't scream catastrophe until you look back and realize the ground was cracking long before the collapse. For Jeffrey Dahmer, that moment came in 1978, just weeks after graduating high school. While his classmates planned dorm rooms and road trips, Dahmer stood on the side of a road in Ohio and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Steven Hicks, 18 years old, hitchhiking to a rock concert. Hair shaggy, the kind of kid who trusted strangers, because why wouldn't you in the late 70s? Dahmer picked him up. Friendly at first, quiet conversation, the kind of awkward politeness that masked a storm. They went back to Dahmer's house, drank a few beers. Hours passed. But when Hicks mentioned leaving, when he said he had to go, something snapped in Dahmer. That primal terror of abandonment flared into violence. He struck Hicks with a dumbbell. Not once, not twice, but until silence filled the room. And then, in a calmness that chills the marrow, Dahmer dismembered him. He scattered the pieces like someone disposing of clutter after spring cleaning. Hicks's family waited for a call that never came, filed a missing persons report that became another file gathering dust. The world didn't notice. A young man disappeared, and life kept moving. That's the pattern that should terrify us most. Not the sudden explosion of madness, but the quiet tolerance of society. Hicks vanished, and Dahmer walked free. He enrolled in college, briefly joined the army, drifted in and out of jobs. A murderer hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by the sheer ordinariness of his existence. And what's more haunting is the psychological tremor beneath it. Dahmer felt both horror and exhilaration. He knew he had crossed a threshold, but instead of retreating, the act carved a groove in his mind. He replayed it, refined it, fantasized about it. Hicks wasn't just his first victim. He was the spark that lit the fuse. If you pause here at this first disturbance, you might wonder, what if someone had noticed? What if the missing hitchhiker had drawn more attention? What if Dahmer had been caught in 1978 instead of 1991? How many lives could have been spared? That what if is a knife twist that never goes away. Because in hindsight, the signs weren't invisible. They were ignored. And ignoring monsters only feeds them. The strange thing about Jeffrey Dahmer's story is how long the world let him drift through the margins without asking the obvious questions. After Steven Hicks, there was a gap, nearly a decade of silence, at least on the surface. A pause in the violence, or so it seemed. But silence doesn't mean peace. Silence is just the sound of hunger rehearsing its next move. By the mid-1980s, Dahmer had relocated to Milwaukee. He lived in small, unimpressive apartments, worked menial jobs, drank heavily, and kept to himself. But inside that solitude, the fantasies grew louder. He began luring men from bars, bathhouses, and bus stops. Most were young. Most were men of color. Most were vulnerable in ways society didn't want to confront. They disappeared into his orbit like moths into a flame. And like moths, they never flew out again. Neighbors started noticing things. The smells, for one. That sour, putrid stench seeping from apartment 213. Dahmer brushed it off with excuses about spoiled meat or exotic fish gone bad. And people believed him. Because who wants to believe their neighbor is turning his living room into a butcher's gallery? It's easier to assume it's rotten pork chops than face the truth that something far worse is festering on the other side of the wall. There were sounds, too. Power tools buzzing at odd hours, muffled thuds, the hum of a drill when no construction was happening. And yet, no police raids, no serious interventions. People complained, shrugged, went back to their lives. Every ignored call, every dismissed report became a silent permission slip for Dahmer to continue. The mystery deepened further when law enforcement itself brushed against the horror and stepped away. In one infamous incident, a 14-year-old boy staggered into the street, drugged and incoherent, barely able to stand. Neighbors called the police, begged them to act. But Dahmer, with his awkward calm, convinced officers it was just a lover's quarrel. They returned the boy to Dahmer's apartment. Hours later, the boy was dead. It's moments like this where reality feels too absurd to process. The monster wasn't hiding in shadows. He opened his door to uniformed officers, smiled, and watched them hand him back his victim. If horror films followed that script, we'd call it unbelievable, too contrived. But in Milwaukee, it was real. By now, the case wasn't just about Dahmer's compulsions. It was about systemic blindness. Neighbors dismissed, victims unheard, police uninterested. A whole city orbiting a black hole, pretending it wasn't there. Every missed chance to stop him tightened the knot, until unraveling it would require a catastrophe no one could ignore. When the whole nightmare finally ruptured in July 1991, it wasn't the result of some grand sting operation or a brilliant detective piecing together threads. It was luck. Sheer, stupid luck. Tracy Edwards, a would-be victim, managed to escape Dahmer's apartment wearing only a handcuff on one wrist. He flagged down police, begged them to follow him back to the source of his terror. And when officers finally stepped through that beige door of the Oxford apartments, they stumbled not onto a mystery, but into the middle of a horror museum. The refrigerator held a human head. The freezer, wrapped parcels labeled as though for storage, contained flesh. Drawers were lined with Polaroids of dismembered bodies, Dahmer posing them like grotesque dolls in his own theater. Large blue vats in the bedroom bubbled with acid, liquefying what had once been human beings. The investigation was a logistical nightmare, not because evidence was scarce, but because there was too much of it. Detectives had to map out bone fragments, catalog teeth, identify partial remains. Who belonged to which piece? Which name matched which pile? Families begged for answers, but how do you tell a mother that her son's skull was sitting in a box, neatly preserved with bleach, that his heart had been kept in a freezer bag as though it were nothing more than leftovers? And then came the question that clawed at everyone's mind. Why? Why cannibalism? Why trophies? Dahmer's confessions, delivered with eerie calm, offered explanations that were both chilling and disturbingly mundane. He wanted them to stay. He wanted control. He wanted companionship that could never leave. His words weren't a madman's ravings. They were painfully logical, the kind of twisted logic that makes you sick precisely because it makes sense to him. Psychologists and criminologists pored over the case. Some argued it was about power, the ultimate domination of another human. Others suggested it was loneliness metastasized into obsession, an intimacy so corrupted it could only be expressed through consumption. Theories swirled like vultures: necrophilia, abandonment trauma, paraphilic disorder, antisocial personality traits. Everyone tried to categorize him, box him, label him, as if one neat word could tame the chaos he embodied. But the contradictions refused to resolve. Dahmer wasn't the typical predator. He wasn't charismatic like Bundy, or theatrically violent like Manson. He was painfully ordinary, which made his actions feel even more incomprehensible. He didn't kill for spectacle. He killed for quiet, for stillness, for company. And in that quiet, investigators were left piecing together not just bones, but motives, half-formed, contradictory, elusive. Theories explained parts of him, but never the whole. As though understanding Dahmer was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces had been deliberately burned. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't just a courtroom spectacle. It was a psychological autopsy. The world sat transfixed, waiting to see if this pale, soft-spoken man in glasses would be declared insane, a beast with no tether to reality, or sane, and therefore fully responsible for every single calculated act. That was the axis on which everything turned, monster or man. Prosecutors painted him as coldly methodical. They held up the Polaroids, the vats, the freezer bags, as if each grotesque exhibit was a bullet fired into any notion of mercy. Dahmer knew what he was doing. He bought the tools, scouted his victims, planned the aftermath. That's not madness, they argued. That's choice. The defense countered with psychology. They argued that no rational mind could commit these acts, that his compulsions were the throes of fractured psyche. Words like necrophilia, paraphilia, borderline psychosis echoed through the chamber. It was less a trial than a theater of definitions. What does it mean to be insane? To be responsible? To be human? But then came the moment that twisted everything. Dahmer himself took the stand, and his voice, measured, almost weary, didn't sound like the rant of a lunatic. It was worse. He admitted his urges calmly, confessed his rituals with chilling precision. "I knew it was wrong," he said, as if reciting a grocery list. That phrase landed like a hammer blow. He knew. The turning point wasn't some dramatic twist of evidence. It was a realization that Dahmer straddled the line between sanity and monstrosity. He wasn't attached from reality, he was anchored in it. And he still chose the abyss. The breakdown wasn't his, it was ours. The public, the jury, the families. Everyone broke beneath the weight of knowing that evil doesn't need to be insane to thrive. It can be rational. It can be meticulous. It can smile politely while planning its next violation. The jury deliberated barely 5 hours before delivering the verdict. Guilty on 15 counts of murder, life imprisonment, stacked like bricks, 957 years in total. It should have felt like resolution, but it didn't, because the verdict didn't answer the central question. The trial exposed it, twisted it, left it bleeding in front of us. If a man so ordinary could harbor desire so catastrophic, what shield do we really have against the shadows in our own neighborhoods? That's the breakdown, the shattering of the illusion that monsters look different from us. The prison gates swallowed Jeffrey Dahmer in 1992, but the bars didn't extinguish the unease. Technically, justice had been served. 15 life sentences, a punishment so absurdly long it mocked the idea of ever finishing it. Yet the feeling of resolution never really arrived. There were still names unaccounted for, still fragments of bone that couldn't be matched to a family, still the unanswered why echoing in every courtroom corridor. Dahmer himself didn't resist the sentence. In fact, he seemed relieved. He told reporters he was glad it was over, as if the trial had drained him more than the killings ever did. He even agreed to interviews, speaking with chilling frankness about his compulsions, the way someone might describe a bad habit. It's a process, he explained. It doesn't happen overnight. Those words stuck like nails. He wasn't painting himself as a supernatural creature, just a man who let his appetites rot into something unrecognizable. But the lingering questions refused to die. Was Dahmer truly an aberration, a freak of nature? Or was he a byproduct of neglect, societal indifference, police apathy, a culture that didn't listen when marginalized communities screamed about their missing sons? If officers had taken that 14-year-old boy seriously, if neighbors had been heard, if systems had cared, would Jeffrey Dahmer have been stopped years earlier? The evidence suggests yes, which means every subsequent victim wasn't just Dahmer's. They were also casualties of blindness. And then there's the question of his desire. Was it purely compulsion, or was it choice dressed up as sickness? He claimed he wanted to create zombies, partners stripped of will but preserved in body, companions who wouldn't abandon him. He experimented with chemicals, drilled skulls, injected acid into brains, all in pursuit of stillness masquerading as intimacy. Was that madness, or was it a grotesque parody of love? The answer depends on how much humanity you're willing to grant him. The official resolution is clear. Dahmer was convicted, imprisoned, neutralized. But the unofficial one, the one that festers in the cultural bloodstream, isn't neat. The case leaves behind questions with no satisfying answers. How do you categorize a man who looks ordinary, yet dreams of freezing time through dismemberment? How do you process a justice system that delivered a verdict only after years of catastrophic failure? Resolution came with handcuffs and a gavel. But what lingers is a gnawing truth that some questions don't end with sentence. They echo endlessly, like footsteps in a dark hallway you can't quite escape. The story didn't end with a cell door slamming. Jeffrey Dahmer's name became a cultural parasite, burrowing into headlines, documentaries, late-night talk show punchlines. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He was a symbol, a cautionary tale, a grotesque brand that America couldn't stop repeating. The Oxford apartments, where he had constructed his kingdom of silence, were demolished in 1992, an attempt at erasing memory. But you can't bulldoze ghosts. The land still sits vacant, as if the ground itself refuses to be built upon, poisoned by what happened there. For the families of the victims, the aftermath was less symbolic and more suffocating. Their sons, brothers, lovers reduced to exhibits in a trial, the bone fragments in evidence bags. Some mothers begged for their children's remains back, only to be handed envelopes of ashes. Grief metastasized into rage, lawsuits, public confrontations. At Dahmer's sentencing, Rita Isbell, Sister Victimero Lindsay, erupted in court, screaming, lunging at him with years of fury. It was the rawest moment of truth. No carefully worded legal statement could compete with a sister trying to claw justice out of the man who stole her brother. Society, meanwhile, devoured the case like it devours all spectacles. Horror sells. True crime books, TV specials, tabloid covers. Dahmer's face was everywhere, framed not as a man but as a living headline. Milwaukee tried to move on, but the city's image was stained. It wasn't just about one man's atrocities. It was about a community forced to confront how blind it had been, how indifferent to the cries of its most vulnerable citizens. Even the justice system couldn't hold him forever. In 1994, Dahmer was bludgeoned to death in prison by another inmate, Christopher Scarver. Irony or inevitability depends on how you look at it. Some saw it as cosmic justice, the universe delivering a punishment the courts couldn't. Others saw it as a cop-out, an escape from the endless years of confinement he had been sentenced to endure. His death didn't close the book. It tore out the last chapter and left us staring at the ripped edges. Psychologists still dissect his interviews. Artists, filmmakers, writers revisit his crimes like a scab that can't stop being picked. The legacy isn't neat. It's messy, contradictory, grotesque. A reminder that beneath the fluorescent buzz of any city, behind the locked doors of any neighbor's apartment, darkness might be humming quietly, waiting to be discovered. There's a line that keeps rattling in my head. Something Dahmer once admitted with the bluntness of a man who knew there was no redemption waiting for him. He said he wished he could stop, that he didn't understand why he did what he did, but the urges were like a never-ending craving. Imagine that. Hunger as identity. Desire so warped it becomes indistinguishable from the self. We like to believe monsters are separate from us, some genetic glitch or supernatural anomaly. But Dahmer's story rips that comfort away. He wasn't possessed, wasn't foaming at the mouth, wasn't pacing in a padded cell. He was soft-spoken, neat, forgettable. The kind of man you might dismiss at a bus stop, never guessing he was rehearsing fantasies of freezing time, of preserving bodies like glass figurines. That ordinariness is a true terror. Evil doesn't need fangs. It can wear wireframe glasses and offer you a drink. And what lingers long after the trial transcripts gather dust is the question of complicity. How many times could this have been stopped? How many families could have been spared if the police had listened? If neighbors had been taken seriously, if society cared more about the voices of those living on the margins? Dahmer didn't operate in a vacuum. He thrived in silence, in indifference, in systems that didn't believe certain lives mattered enough to protect. When I think of Jeffrey Dahmer, I don't just think of him. I think of all the people who smelled something strange, who heard something off, who looked the other way. I think of the boys who trusted him, not because they were naive, but because the world told them trust was the only way to survive. And I think of how thin the wall is between ordinary life and unthinkable horror. Sometimes it's just drywall, a single locked door, the sound of a humming fridge. There is no neat moral, no ribbon to tie around this case. Just a chilling reminder. The real abyss doesn't roar. It whispers. It waits. It wears a human face. And when you finally see it clearly, you're left asking a question that never stops echoing. If evil can look that normal, how many times have we already walked past it without knowing? Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have. And I hope to see you all again in the next case.